Hello, welcome to Forward Focus. My name's Tom Burdick. Today's show is called WTO on the Run Again. Today's show we're going to talk a little bit about the WTO protests, what their origins were, and a little bit more information about the WTO as an organization and what its impact is potentially in our lives. On today's show we've got a guest with us, a former King County councilman, three-term King County councilman, Brian Derdowski. Brian, you've served, what, 12 years in the King County Council?
10 years, all through the 90s.
10 years. And you've been an observer of national politics and international politics as a part of your job because you have a lot of trade issues coming through Seattle. Yeah. Brian, I found it interesting last year. You were literally the first and only elected official we had in the state that came out and talked to us about the WTO and why we should be concerned about it. And it was surprising in its absence. A lot of us simply had no clue what the WTO was. Right. So tell us a little bit about that and what your involvement, your first understanding of that group was.
Well, first of all, my involvement began with when my son called me from college and said, "Dad, you've got to pay attention to the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, that the implications on America, the implications on state and local government were enormous." And so we started to do some research, and I succeeded in getting the King County Council to adopt a resolution opposing, and this was a unanimous vote, opposing an agreement that the World Trade Organization was working on, which was called the Multilateral Agreement on Investments. And then from that, we built a coalition. Even though our office was the first office to be involved in this issue in this state, we did rapidly build a coalition of quite a number of elected officials, though not anywhere near enough, that were raising very serious questions about the WTO. Now, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, was created in 1995. And so the first thing that people tell you, free trade people, when they are defending the World Trade Organization, is they'll say, well, gee, you know, trade is inexorable. We need trade for world prosperity. It's inevitable. But the point here is that we've had world trade and a liberalized trade regime ever since World War II. But we've only had the World Trade Organization for the last 5 years. And the protests in the street, the protests throughout the world are focused on the unfair, undemocratic, and unbalanced decisions that are coming out of such organizations as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. It was interesting that last week, while we had about 2,500 people in the streets demonstrating against the WTO.
Here in Seattle, it was the one-year anniversary of the meeting that was held. The World Trade Organization had, was it a worldwide meeting that was attempted a year ago, and there were quite a number of protests and social awareness. So then a year later, another street protest.
It was an anniversary celebration involving a number of groups, but you know, you could not read anywhere in any of the local papers the fact that on Wednesday of last week, between 60 and 100,000 people were protesting against globalization, using many of the same arguments and the same techniques that were used locally in France. And that since the protests in Seattle and before the November 30 event last year, there were protests throughout the world. This is really an international movement.
I recall a year before, my first awareness of the WTO was there was a very loud and raucous protest in Bern, Switzerland. Europeans take their protest very seriously.
Well, they do.
And it was quite you know, it was the first time the world was really awakened to that organization. And you know, originally my thought was, well, it's kind of an anti-corporate, anti-greed sort of street movement, but yet the opposition to the WTO has picked up a lot of very, very disparate voices.
That's right.
People who normally have very little time for each other are all standing up and opposing this organization.
That's right.
So, I mean, what's going on? What sort of threats do they? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I think you're quite correct in pointing out that this is a fairly broad-based movement. There are in Congress today, in our House of Representatives, quite a number of votes of Congress members that would vote today to actually pull America out of the WTO. When I was in Washington, D.C. earlier this year, I had discussions with our own Congressman Jack Metcalf, who sponsored a resolution to pull the United States out of the WTO. And we spoke and about developing a larger base for this effort. My understanding is that there's somewhere around 30 or 35 Republican votes in Congress today to pull us out. Another Congress member, Dennis Kucinich from Ohio, has offered an amendment that would prohibit the federal government from imposing sanctions against state and local governments who violate trade agreements, or trade decrees or fiats that come from the WTO. And the last time he offered that amendment to a budget proposal, he had 196 congressional votes on his side, and his amendment failed 211 to 196. And what that amendment would do would be to eviscerate the ability of the World Trade Organization, the current authority the WTO organization has, to reach down to state and local government laws and ordinances, and to be able to have an enforcement mechanism implemented by the federal government. The way it works is this. I'll give you an example. In the state of Washington, we have a law that prohibits the export of raw timber from state-owned lands.
Okay.
And the argument in support of that has been that we want to have sawmill jobs. We want to get as much employment as we can out of the state-owned natural resources.
So rather than sending the whole the raw log overseas, we want to see it milled and brought to finished product here locally to provide jobs locally.
That's right.
Okay.
And there's a law that prohibits the export of raw logs off of state land.
Okay.
Well, that Weyerhaeuser and Plum Creek Timber and some of the larger timber organizations in the world have been working through the WTO to get an agreement that would prohibit laws of that sort. And in fact, had the talks succeeded last year, had the WTO succeeded in their agenda last year, they would have come to that agreement. So now here's what would happen.
Okay.
If then the state of Washington had this law, then a corporation, a foreign corporation, could sue, or a Weyerhaeuser could sue to the World Trade Organization, and it would be heard by a 3-member tribunal that would meet in Switzerland in secret. There would be no public input. No public input. We could not file amicus briefs. In fact, you may very well not be able to read the actual decision that would come out of that.
They would
tribunal.
be suing an American local government, a state government.
They would actually be suing America.
Okay.
And then what would happen is, if the World Trade Organization made the decision that that law was a violation of trade, then it would have the authority to impose a sanction against the United States government for an action that the state of Washington did. The United States government then could turn around and could fine the state of Washington for having such a law in the books. They could, for example, deduct money out of our transit support, or money that goes to the state for education, or any of a number of other mechanisms to it. Right.
All right, well, we want to thank you today for joining us here on Forward Focus. Again, my guest, 3-time King County Councilman Brian Derdowski, and thank you for joining us today talking about the WTO. Well, we covered it pretty well.
Well, not that. We had a lot of issues there.
Interesting.